All right, well, welcome everyone. Good afternoon or good whatever time it is, wherever you happen to be. My name is Jeff Kyung McLean and welcome to the University of Idaho's China on the Palouse Speakers Series. The China on the Palouse Speakers Series is a series where we try to bring in, scholars of, ability and with, on very interesting topics, bring them to the University of Idaho, formerly in person, now on Zoom, of course, just to give University of Idaho faculty, students, and Idaho community at large a bigger picture about what's going on in China, both past and present. And I would like to, before we get into today's speaker, I would just mention a few people who've helped us with this, Professor Peter Tan, and also Ms. Abby Margell for moral support and logistical support. And then also we have a partner university in China, South China University of Technology, which is also supporting our speaker series. So we thank them as well. So today we are very honored to have Dr. Stefania Travagnin with us, speaking on the topic of non-eminent nuns in modern Sichuan Buddhism, listening to marginal female experiences. Dr. Travagnin is a professor at SOAS, University of London. Her research investigates Buddhist patterns in modern China and Taiwan. And recently she has explored nuns, communities, and education. She's author of many articles, editor of volumes. You can easily find these on the internet. And if you have a good university library, you can find even more. And she's currently directing with Elena Belusi the project Mapping Religious Diversity in Modern Sichuan, which I'm also involved in. So before we begin and turn the microphone over to Dr. Travagnin, I would like to say a little bit logistical matters for today. We, as we typically do with these, if you've been here before, you know the routine. First, we will hear the talk, and at the end of the talk, we will take questions. And those questions we strongly prefer. In fact, we only go through the Q&A function. So everyone, if you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should see the Q&A. Please type in your questions there. And you can type in questions really at any point, but we won't approach them until the end of the talk. So you can put your questions in. I will then assess and read some directly. Others I may combine. If there's kind of repetitive questions, I may combine a few together and then ask them to our speaker. Please do not use the raise hand function. We will not be doing the old hand thing. So just stick with the Q&A and that will be good for us. And the whole event is about 1 hour, give or take. So that is the logistical matters. And without further ado, Dr. Travagnin.
Okay, I will share the screen. Okay, could you all see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
It's all fine, okay. Thank you very much, Jeff, for this very, very kind invitation and also for your very nice introduction. Today, I'm going to present some results of a multi-year project, Mapping Religious Diversity in Modern Sichuan, that Jeff mentioned before, which is founded by the Zhang Jingguo Foundation for International Scholarly Exchange. This project, that is directed by Elena Belusi and myself, counts the participation of more than 10 scholars coming from different disciplinary training, historian, anthropologists, sociologists, people working on textual studies, and so on. We explore dynamics and paradigm of religious diversity in Sichuan in the Qing and Republican period. And we have started uploading data on our website, which you can see on this slide, including a digital map and a timeline. This is just a screenshot of a digital map. And I would really love to invite you to check the website and see the different sites that we have been working on and the different sub-projects that each of us has been looking at. So why a project on Sichuan? Well, we thought that rather than concentrate on coastal areas or large urban centers as done in the majority of recent publications, we decided to investigate this lesser known and understudied but extremely influential geographical area of China. This project addresses Sichuan as a place that needs to be relocated from the periphery to the center of the study of Chinese religions. It reveals Sichuan as an active center of knowledge, of religious knowledge production in itself, and not just the recipient of knowledge transmission from the more advanced coastal areas. Within China, the province of Sichuan is also unique for the high concentration of ethnic and religious diversity and the intertwined net of heterogeneous communities that form the local religious landscape, also due to the geographical location in the southwestern part of China. Sichuan is also crucial for the overall history of religions of China, and this uniqueness makes certainly Sichuan a crucial case studies of religious and ethnic diversity. We are looking at two different kinds of inquiries. On the one hand, we are looking at form of cooperation, coexistence, and exchange between different religious identities and groups, synchronically and diachronically, going from communities hosting and merging multi-faith beliefs and rituals and the formation of inter-religious networks to sites that have changed religious and cultural identities throughout the time and social meanings. And on the other hand, we're also looking at development of individual tradition within Sichuan, again, synchronically and diachronically, and in dialogue with members of the same traditions in other regions. And this dialogue may eventually generate intra-religious network. My own research has addressed both this line of inquiry. For today, I will talk mostly of one specific tradition, Buddhist community, and as Jeff kindly asked me, I will talk specifically about nuns in the first half of the 20th century. As I said, this project tried to bring the periphery, Sichuan, to the center, and following the same reasoning, I aim within the Sichuan border to shed light also to marginal players and bring those players from the periphery to the center of the Buddhist sphere. I'm not working on those monks, nuns, or lay intellectuals who are often taken as paradigm of the history of modern Chinese Buddhism, but those who are not included in the list of eminent and renowned actors. So looking at suburban areas, small temples, so what that are people who are actually monks and nuns, in this case nuns, who are actually leaders of micro-community. These non-eminent Buddhists have become invisible on the national and international level, while they have been and continue to be visible and eminent on a more local level. In a previous talk and publication, I've explained how I rethink the idea of invisibility as invisibility written in a different way, in the sense that these actors are invisible for some on the national level or in some scholarship, but are definitely visible for the local community. Conveying visibility to these communities and individuals who produce several effects. It implies a revision of the concept of eminence and suggests the reevaluation of local history and memories, a revision of the history of Sichuan and even Chinese Buddhism, and the consequent repositioning of actors, sites, and paradigm. And of course, I'm not the only one looking at non-eminent Buddhists. Mark Rowe at McMaster University is doing a long-term project on similar issues when it comes to Japan. This invisibility factor is not a condition just of nuns and women. In fact, there are numerous monks who were also leaders of community, but are not remembered in general surveys just a century later. Nonetheless, today we'll focus on nuns and their role in creating communities, defining dynamics and their strategies to memorialize themselves. We can confidently say that in the recent years, scholarship on nuns and women in Chinese Buddhism or religion in general has increased, offering a nice counterpart to the male-centered portraits and also advancing new discourses of religion in China. To this field of studies, I contribute a picture of a Sichuanese nuns in the Republican period with some observation also to what's going on today. But I'm not gonna talk about Long Lian, for instance, who is the very famous nun that lived throughout the 20th century in Sichuan. I'm gonna look at other nuns, those who became nuns even before Long Lian. Space is another important concept for the overall Sichuan project, and space is indeed not intended as a territory that is a passive container of a living society, but like an active agent in the making of a community and a network. Space and communities alternate each other as subject and object in the power dynamics of a religious and social landscape. And today I will show you how specific space have facilitated the formation of particular dynamics. So I will introduce a few case studies from my research and I will present the nun experience, going through a few teams. And this is definitely still a work in progress in the sense that I visited a number of communities, and is also a research that is based on interviews and meetings that I've done with monks, nuns, material from archives, temple records, unpublished documents from temples, but also any sort of inscription. As you can see here, me taking photos of inscription on different rocks. So I try to combine different forms of information to revive and give more visibility to this hidden history. So today I will look at a few areas, some areas in the city of Chengdu, and then Neijiang and Suining. So I'm looking at the Republican period and where the administration of the organization of Chengdu and the rest of Sichuan was very different from today. So what I'm going to look at is few nunneries, Jishan and Tizan nunneries that are part of Huaiyan and Chengdu. Xian means county, and where the two central counties that you can find in Chengdu. And then we're going to the peripheries, and we are going to look at Pi and Wenjiang, so two other counties. And for Wenjiang, we are looking at specific schools for nuns, while in Pi, we are looking at two nunneries and leadership of very strong nuns. Neijiang, I'm going to explain the history of Suining nunnery, and Suining, with a very, very particular town, we are looking at Idaho Buddhist Society, that then was renamed Jinyechan Nunnery, and then the Qingfu Nunnery, which is very, very small. In terms of themes, I'm going to look at leadership, female leadership, nuns leadership, and what these nuns leaders in the community, what they accomplish. Education for nuns, both schools that have been opened for nuns, so the importance given to education for nuns, but also education activities that have been run and organized by nuns for other nuns. Then women as authors. It's not very easy to find women, religious women in early Republican period, especially nuns, or these kind of nuns that were not really publishing in Buddhist journals at that time. They were authoring books, but actually there have been a number of nuns that were authoring, especially poems or other sort of practice and manuals. Then I'm going to see the role of nuns during the Sino-Japanese War, 1937 to 1945, and some what I call strategies of memorialization. So how they try to actually historicize themselves, even if their stories have never been important in a general survey of Buddhism. Now, just some maps. So what you can see here in red is actually Sichuan within China, and you can also see that Sichuan is in the southwest part of China, so it's exposed to Southeast Asia, so Myanmar, Thailand, and a number of Theravada communities, but it's also close to Tibet. These create a very, very rich convergence of religious activities and religious minorities. And here is a kind of zoom in the areas that we're going to talk about today. So the city of Chengdu that you can see here, this is from Paitu, so it's a very, very contemporary map, but just to give you an idea of the distance. And Suining, and then here is Neijiang. As I said, these are just 3 areas where I did my research. I also went to Luzhou, Leshan, Nanchon, so a number of other places. Since we talk about Chengdu, as you see, Chengdu is quite big. I'm going to show you this photo that I found in a book about Chengdu in the Republican period. And it's very nice because you can see, so what is called Chengdu Xian, and then the Huaiyan Xian is very close by, that was the kind of a center of Chengdu. And very far you find the Pi Xian and Wenjiang. So these areas we really see, now there are 2 districts part of the metropolitan Chengdu, and actually it takes more than an hour and a half to go to Pi Xian from the central Chengdu by car. But they were really conceived as different centers and not so close to like really suburban center, not so close to the central area of Chengdu, where most of the most important activities when it comes to Buddhism and other religions were conducted. So just to give you an idea of how distant these two districts were from Chengdu. Now, we are talking about nuns, but I also want to make an observation that very often many of these nuns were actually helped by specific monks. So I want to mention monk Chang Yuan, and this is one of the rare image about Chang Yuan, who lived at the end of the Qing period and throughout the Republican period, and he was inspired by nuns. So this is very important. These monks were not just supervising and helping nuns, but somehow they were also inspired by female practitioners, either within their families, so lay Buddhist practitioner, or by nuns themselves. The monk Chang Yuan actually was inspired by nuns, and one in specific that I'm going to talk about later. And because of that, he decided to become a monk. And then later on in his career, he devoted lots of time to create schools for nuns. And the other one is Qin Fu, who was active, especially in Suining. This is one of the portraits with, very often his name is misspelled like Qin Fu. And again, this other monk is also cooperating. So you see monks helping nuns, but you also need to see a kind of very mutual cooperation between male ordained Buddhist and female ordained Buddhist. Now, let's start with Pixian. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to explain to you a little bit of the history of Buddhism of these different areas, Pixian, Wenjian, and especially Pixian, Wenjian, Xian, and then Neijiang and Suining. And then I'm going to explain a little bit the history of the nunneries that I'm going to talk about today, just to give you a context of the area. Since space is important, that can also, the religious history of these specific spaces can give you an idea of why certain Buddhist phenomena, especially something about nuns, happen. So Pixian, actually, is one of the oldest parts of Chengdu, and apparently Buddhism was present there since the Eastern Han, so since the so-called official beginning of formation of Buddhism in China, and developed and prospered until 1960, with exception of some decline during the Ming period. At the moment, there are only 4 temples that have been reopened after the end of the Cultural Revolution. One is the Zhongxin Nunnery, Juyin Nunnery that we are going to talk about today, and then Huguo and Pingle Monastery. So 2 nunneries for nuns and 2 monasteries of monks. And Zhongxin was actually the very first temple to be reopened after the end of the Cultural Revolution, the opening to space of religion in the 80s, and it became a reference point for the entire community. Generally, the Buddhist landscape in the late Qing and Republican period experienced the first stage of expansion and a second phase of reduction. So somehow the history found the 1930s as a landmark, and there's been a very strong development until the 1930s, and especially when it comes to property. So this is a farming and area. So a number of monasteries actually were owning lots of lands that were then renting. And then you have a number of farmers working on these lands. But in 1930, it was decided that temples could own only a certain amount of land, and the rest was going to be given to the militaries. Nonetheless, even if we have this reduction of space to temple, still you find not a decrease in qualitative and quantitative presence of Buddhism in the territory. Indeed, in 1948, there have been 82 Buddhist temples and a monastic population of 317 monastics. And then later on, at the very end of the Republican period, it seems that you have 155 Buddhist temples between nunneries and male monasteries, and 318 monastics between nuns and monks. So it's a very big population if you think that now there are only 4 of them. And in the 1950s, you start seeing changes like everywhere else in China. Then that got even worse in the 60s, and then with the Cultural Revolution. A number of temples were turned into schools, others were destroyed, others were given as residence for the farmers, others were used as governmental office. So the sacred sites is not used as a sacred site anymore. But in the Republican period, you have quite a big cohort of temples. One of them is the Zhongxing nunnery that I said before. It was the very first temple to be reopened after the end of the Cultural Revolution. It has a very long history as a male temple since the Tang period, and then it was destroyed and then it was rebuilt. It's very important what happened in the Qing period, where a woman of a quite wealthy family decided to use this place as a place for a kind of hereditary temple for herself, for her own practice. After that, it was kind of abandoned completely after 1949. And then in the early 1980s, it was a special nun, the nun Longshow, a nun that guided the teams of other nuns in reconstructing the site. This nun was very familiar with the specific temple because she used to live there during the Republican period. They have done any sort of fundraising, and then they were able to reopen. They applied for being functioning again as a temple, and that they became the very first site to be reopened officially in 1986 as a functioning temple. There were more than 30 resident nuns at the time of the opening. However, in my last visit in August 2019, there were just slightly more than 10 of them. And this is an image of the courtyard with the main shrine hall. It's quite a big temple, and this is the main gate of a temple. Another nunnery in the P district, in the P-Xian, that now is called P2, is called Suining nunnery. This also has a very long history. It was called Power on An. Then it was built in the Ming period. The main shrine was renovated during the Qing in the beginning of the 18th century. And the name then was changed into Suining Temple. The modern substantial development took place under the leadership of a nun. So again, if Longshow helped to rebuild Zhongxing nunnery after the 80s, you have at the very end of the 19th century, a Buddhist nun called Fan Chon, who was coming from another temple, who went to Suining and decided to rebuild it. It made a kind of, and she became really a leader of the community over there. She was very important that they made even a statue for her inside the temple. Unfortunately, the statue has been lost. There is a very nice inscription from the end of the 18th century, but unfortunately is very ruined. It's very difficult to read. But there are still some evidence of the kind of life that Fan Chon, this nun Fan Chon, wanted. And we're going to talk a little bit more about her later. Wenjiang, so now move to another district. Buddhism here well, the very first traces of Buddhism that we have started in the Tang period. Now, I put some numbers here because I want you to see how the Republican period was, as you can see, there were a number of monastics and also big number of temples. But what is very important here is to see the ratio between monks and nuns. And then as you notice, and this is the only case, one of the very few cases that I found so far, you have much more nuns than monks. This is easily explained because at the beginning, during the Republican period, a number of monks were first of all asked to move to Wenjiang to rebuild some temples, but then they left to go to the more central area of Chengdu, for instance. And so most of the temples were left to the hands of nuns. So nuns were actually running the temples when monks were going to the bigger temple in Chengdu. And so this is one of the reasons why there were many nuns. Another one it was very common at that time to have the phenomenon of the child nun, yoni, so young girls that were left orphan, left by family or being orphaned and left to the monastery, and they were kind of growing up inside the monastery. And this is why, besides 10 temples run by monks, most of the other sites were actually run by nuns, and many of them were really young baby nuns, or they were just novices, were not fully ordained. But this is another reason why there were so many women within the temple. After the Cultural Revolution and with the early reopening of religious activities in the 1980s, monastics started reappearing, even if in low number. Today, we have in the early 2000s, the last records that I have is of 20 monastics only this district. But of course, this is still a very, very rich and lively Buddhist center if you think of all the lay believers that still live here. We're going to analyze a few schools that were opened for nuns by Chen Yuan, the monk that I mentioned at the very beginning, in a second. As I said, there were also some nunneries, like Jinshan Nunnery and Tizan Nunnery, that were not in this suburban area, but more in the central part of Chengdu. Now, Jinshan Nunnery is now in Neijiang district, which is where also the Wenshu Monastery, Aitao Hall, and major centers are present, while the Tizan An that doesn't exist anymore is in the Jinjiang district, which is also very close to the main square in Chengdu. This is a temple that was founded in the Qin period. At the beginning was called Huaguan Temple because it was a temple dedicated to the Huaguan Bodhisattva. It was a Buddhist nun Jichen that turned this place as an abbot of practice for women in the 1778. And then it was enlarged later. There was a big fire that destroyed most of the temple, but the story says that the fire stopped in front of Guanyin, of a statue of Guanyin that you find in the main shrine hall. And that's why they make a big celebration to celebrate the supernatural power of Guanyin that helped to stop the fire in the 1864. Then the temple was renamed Jinshan Nunnery, and it seems that this nun Pute was very important. It was abbess at that time. The history of this nunnery it was quite complicated to reconstruct, but also this nun Pute is found inside the main shrine hall with a different name, with the name Jichen, different characters, but there are some question marks of whether or not we're talking about the same nun or if it's a different nun. But this says a lot about how difficult it is to reconstruct the history of these very, very small temples. In the Republican period, this was just an hereditary temple, but then turned into a public monastery. But what is important is this is a very small temple, very hidden. I found it by accident myself. But since the Nanjichen onwards, we have more than 13 different generations of nuns that succeeded in this temple. So this makes one of a very, very important nunnery in the history of Buddhist nuns and female Buddhism in modern China. And this temple is actually the reason why, when I found this temple, I decided to keep working on Sichuan, precisely to study more of these very small sites. It's a very small site that is still very much praised, even throughout history, by monks. So this is one of the main door of the temple, the main gate, and this title, that the name Jinshan and this plaque and these verses have been written by the abbot of the Wenshu monastery at the time of the renaming, the 1864, when the temple was renamed Jinshan. Right now there are less than 20 nuns, and they do a number of liturgies, but have a very clear calendars of which sutras are recited and which practices are done. This is one of the rituals that I have witnessed in the 2015. Tizan Nunnery. I don't have photos of that because unfortunately it doesn't exist anymore. Well, first construction was in 1714. And then it was renovated in 1776. It was very well known in the Republican period. The very nice book by Wan Ti on the street culture in Chengdu actually mentioned this specific nunnery. It seems that it was very close to where criminals were then executed. And so the nuns were actually renting some space of the nunnery to hold the coffins of these people before sending them to the burial. So somehow the nunnery it seems that it was quite lucrative activities from the nun. And then this is one of the very few instances where you have mention of a Tizan nunnery in historical sources. And also it was very important because of course they were doing a number of rituals for Tizan. Suining, so we move to eastern Sichuan, and we go to this town that is peculiar because it's been defined, well, Suining defined itself the hometown of Guanyin. So it seems that Princess Miaoshan was born there, and this is a local legend that has been defined really the Buddhist history of Suining. This is of course a popular saying and a popular legend, but that this really became the big frame of Suining. Looking at the historical, the Republican period, you have, since the 1920s, you have a number of activities because of the monk Qingfu, the other monk that I showed you before, the picture of, he will open a number of Buddhist society, and then it was kind of inspiring a number of monastics, but then a number of lay women were also very interested in Buddhism, and so there was the opening of a number of nianfo halls just for women. And then later on, as you can see throughout the Republican period, you have quite a big number of monastics and of course some temples. Things change, like in all the other area in the 50s and then in the 60s. And after the Cultural Revolution in the 1980s, you have 50 monastics, 25 monks and 25 nuns. This is also another place that is very famous for farming. And so a number of these temples were actually surrounded by fields that the nuns were giving to the local lay people to work on. So what kind of temples do you find in Suining? All the female temples you find there, especially this one, is very much connected to this legend that Guanyin was born there. So Princess Miaoshan was born precisely in the place where now Jinye-chan Nunnery is. This is what the local legend said. At the beginning over there, so first there was Princess Miaoshan was born there, and you have this popular histories actually have kind of chronology of when she was born and the sisters were born and so on. Then in the Ming period, the Buddhist nun Huimin built the Huimin Nunnery, but that lasted not very long. And there was an attempt to recover it in the late Qing, but it was thanks to Qingfu, the monk that I mentioned before, that and the call, the kind of the request of a number of lay women that wanted to practice, that there was the building of a nianfo hall at the beginning, and then this nianfo hall turned into the so-called Aitao Buddhist Society, which was really a place for these lay women to practice, but plenty of them became nuns right afterwards. So in 1936, you have the first novices. In the 1940s, after the death of Qingfu, you have another monk, Guan Yi, that was much impressed by these nuns that were living there, especially the number of nuns, and then decided to turn it into a public monastery. And by 1949, you have 90 resident nuns over there, which makes a big center for nuns. And the reason why Qingfu decided to rebuild this site only as a place for women to practice, it was precisely because he had a dream. Amitabha Buddha, in his, well, not a dream, he was meditating. During this meditation, Amitabha Buddha took him to a place where he saw Guanyin crying, and then there was the affirmation that that was the place where Guanyin was born, and then he found that this place was indeed where Huimin Nunnery had been built before, so he decided to kind of revive this place as a place for female practice. These are what I call the three generations, let's say groups of nuns that I did, and I found that all the biographies of all of them that lived in the Republican period in the Aitao Buddhist Society, and then some of them after it was renamed Jinye-chan Nunnery. The first 6 of them were active in the center as lay people first, became novice in 1936, and then fully ordained in 1938. The other two, Zhangqian and Zhangci, were novice in 1938 and then ordained in 1940. What I call the second cluster of nuns, actually two nuns that joined the temple much later. However, they've been ordained in 1917, and which makes these two nuns as probably the earliest nuns from Suining. The third group of nuns are actually disciples of the very first generations of nuns. Qingfu nunnery is also linked somehow to the figure of Qingfu. This is a place that he built at the beginning for himself as a dwelling in the very final years of his life. Then some nuns were moved there during the Sino-Japanese War. So when there was the war with Japan, the nuns of some nunneries in Suining were sent to other locations that were less central, less dangerous for them. So some nuns actually were living here. And then they went back to the Idaho Buddhist Society. It was rebuilt after the end of the Cultural Revolution. And now it's just a small nunnery. It is called Qingfu Si, Qingfu Nunnery, in memory of the monk Qingfu. And this is just one of the whole, as I say, it's a very humble small nunnery, and I found a thing like less than 6 nuns were living there in 2018. Some were especially elderly, so older nuns. And next to them, there is a big field that apparently is a very important field because Qingfu was cremated there. So the field is a kind of holy field for them. And now finally, Neijiang. Neijiang is on the central part of Sichuan. Buddhism was present here since the Tang period. But then it was kind of a golden age of Buddhism. Started it was in the late Qing, especially in the Republican period, where you have more than 100 temples, and in the 30s you have 300, 400 monastics living there. Many temples, of course. I mentioned here only the 3 major ones that somehow also are collaborating and sealing. I call nunnery, even if at the beginning it was a monastery, it was a male monastery. So Shenxue Si is the most important male monastery present in the area of Neijiang. And the photo that you see here is from one hall of the Shenxue monastery. In the 1940s, Neijiang, the very famous intellectual, created a school in here. This is actually this Guanyin Hall is where the school, the Neijiang, opened for lay people and monastics in the 1940s until 1947, where actually the school was held. And the presence of Neijiang attracted even more people to Neijiang and to the study of, and local people to the study of Buddhism. Donglin and Xilin, as you see, is east and west. There were temples that were kind of one in front of the other, divided by, there was a river, but there is also a very nice saying that they were mirroring each other. One was the east, the other one was the west. But the end of 1938, you have a nun that bought the monastery and turned it into a nunnery. So a nun is called Yuan Hui, and is a big leader like Fan Chong that I mentioned before. From the 50s onwards, you have a decline of numbers of monastics, and after the 80s, you have a reopening of temples as sacred sites. But towards in the 50s and 60s, the only 2 centers, real sacred centers, as still functioning as a sacred site until the Cultural Revolution, of course, were Shenxue Monastery and the Xilin Nunnery. And the abbot of Shenxue and the abbess of Xilin have been working a lot in the 50s to try to recruit more monastics, to make sure that there were monastics living and practicing and preaching in Neijiang. So this is pretty, and the Xilin Nunnery, as I said before, was originally a male temple, was built during the Song, renovated during the Ming, and it was renovated. Actually, were 2 temples. One was on the hill, the other one was a little bit down. It started to become smaller at the beginning of the Republican era. In 1938, Yang Hui, this nun, decided to buy it. The monks were actually selling the temple in pieces. So she bought it and turned it into a nunnery. And the number of nuns that she was able to recruit was also quite high. in the end of the Republican period. Now, as I said, I would love to talk to you especially of some themes. And so try, besides looking at the history of these nunneries, also to look at how specific nuns have became kind of outstanding in terms of leadership, education, what happened during the Sino-Japanese War, and so on. Leadership, and for leaders, I intend reference points for the community, founders of or rebuilders of temples, so leaders for the Buddhist monastic community, also for source of inspiration for both male and female practitioners, but also very much leader of the community, so community that goes beyond the temple. When it comes to Jinshan nunnery, the very small nunnery, the one that inspired me to study nuns in Sichuan and Sichuan in specific, the nun Jichen, and it was the one that actually took Huaguan Temple and turned it into a place of practice for women in the 18th century. And then Neijiang in the 20th century, and even was the one that in the 1940, so still in the Republican period, turned this hereditary temple into a public monastery. And it was also able to kind of restructure the temple, and with the help of Chang Yuan, that particular monk, was also opening a school inside for nuns inside Jinshan nunnery. And she was a very educated nun who studied in Chongqing, and was called a kind of prodigy Buddhist child for her skills in understanding Buddhism and explaining Buddhism. And she became really a reference point for the community over there. Fanchon is the nun that probably is most outstanding when it comes to the area of Chengdu. So she became, she was coming from a very well-known family, and she was a nun in another monastery, actually. She became abbess of Juin Si in Pixian in 1876. So what happened is in the 1874, she visited the nunnery of the temple of Juin that was really in ruin. There have been a big flooding, big rain, and the temple, all the Buddhist statues were destroyed, and she felt lots of pain in seeing that scene, and she decided to move back there after 2 years with 2 disciples, and then as soon as she arrived, she got the 3rd disciple, also nuns. And so these 4 nuns, between 1876 to the end of the 1920s, rebuilt, renovated, and enlarged the temple. She was not just a Buddhist nun devoted to the Bodhisattva practice, Mahayana texts, but she was also very much into Chan meditation and Chan school. And she believed in the fact that one day without the Paijan say, a day without work is a day without food. And the importance of farming, that is still that is a big feature associated to Chan. And in fact, the temple was and is still surrounded by fields. And what you see here is one of these fields with nuns today that were collecting some vegetables. And they were renting these fields to the lay community of farmers. And this is what happened in the Republican period, is what is still happening today, of course, in a minor scale and without Fanchon. She became a reference point for a very strong nun. She became a reference point for all the farmers around her. And Chang Yuan, when he was just a 15-year-old boy, started working in this farm, in these fields. And because he was so inspired by Fanchon, they decided to become a monk. I said she was also a reference point for the community, not just because of the farmers who were working there, but because she had a number of activities that she started in the end of the 18th century, and it's something that continued until 1949, sorry. And so she was doing fundraising, distributing rice and other goods to the poor, medicine to the ill, having this big temple fair where she was preaching Buddhism, preaching the spirit of Chan. And so this is something that she started, and after her, there were 7 different generations of nuns that succeeded and continued doing this until, of course, the beginning of the communist era. And then there was the Cultural Revolution. So when it was reopened, it is much smaller than before, but it's still, you have one Buddhist nun living there and all the farmers still work in the fields. So the spirit of Chan, of this, the farming and Buddhist practice merging together, is still alive. So the spirit of Fan Chan is still alive in the today temple. Oh, let's see. Okay. Long Shou, I mentioned before, she's the one that lived in Zhongxin Nunnery in the Republican period and reopened it through fundraising, through gathering other nuns, her disciples, and reopened the temple. And after in 1986, and this was, and Zhongxin was the very first temple to reopen in Pixian. She was also the president of a local chapter of a Buddhist association in the 90s. So this says how important is in terms of leadership, institutional leadership and community leadership. Yang Hui, well, Yang Hui is the one that bought a male temple and turned into a female temple. But her strength was more than that. In the 50s, as I said, when the monastic population was declining, also due to the communist era and what was happening in many other parts of China, she started collaborating with the abbot of Shenshui Monastery and make sure that some Buddhist activities were still run, and then Buddhism was really still kept alive over there in Neijiang. In Suining, you have a number of nuns that can be defined as leader. Chan Tuan is the one that really, she was one of the very first lay women to be part of the Nianfo Hall before the foundation of the Idaho Buddhist Society, and then she became part of the Idaho Buddhist Society in the managing group of nuns. And after when he turned the Idaho Buddhist Society in this public monastery, she became the big abbess. So she always had a kind of leadership position throughout her career in Suining, in this particular nunnery. But other nuns like Chang Wei or Yinling, also nuns of the Idaho Buddhist Society, they were not just working in their nunnery, but they were somehow sent away. And so Chang Wei, during the Sino-Japanese War, as I said, nuns were moved to less central areas to be more safe. And Chang Wei and a few other nuns were moved to this even more suburban area, this temple, Taiping temple, that was very damaged, very small, very humble temple. And she stayed there for more than 10 years. And then she made the big commitment to rebuild the temple with the help of the other nuns, but she was the big leader of the group. So she rebuilt the temple, she got the trust of the farmers living there. She was able to make the fields as working space for the farmers. And she left Taiping temple to go back to Jinyechan Nunnery in 1949, so after the end of the Sino-Japanese War, after she had made sure that the temple was running, it was in a good condition, it was a good sacred site and reference point for the local community. Yinling, right after she became a nun, she went to a small nunnery in Fenji, a place also very close to Suining, and she built a small nunnery there. So you see all these nuns that either built or rebuilt a nunnery or turn a male temple into a female nunnery. Another very important topic is the one of education. I'm gonna go a little bit quick here. So the Republican period is very important in the history of Chinese Buddhism because you see more attention to Sangha education, a kind of renovation to the curricula and to create more opportunities for the Sangha to be educated. And an educated Sangha, it means a different kind of Buddhism. In Sichuan, you have kind of a very, somehow you see some dynamics that reflect what was happening in other parts of China, but also some very much unique traits and unique features of Sichuan. I cannot go so much into detail about the general Sangha education in Sichuan, but I want to show to you how schools for nuns opened by monks or by nuns were an important part of this project. So we are now back in Chengdu, and I'm going here historically. Most of these, well, all of these nunnery, all of these institute for the education of nuns. So when I talk about education of nuns, it was not just a seminary where nuns were learning about Buddhism. At that time, all these schools were running, it was kind of 3-year school, so 6 different semesters. And this is a kind of structure that you find pretty much in all the schools at that time for nuns, at least in Chengdu. They were studying Buddhist texts, Buddhist practice, but also Confucian texts, so the Book of Mencius, the Analects of Confucius, but also classic literature, other classic literature, and Chinese history, math. So and in the 30s was very important to know the regulation of how to manage a temple. So there were a number of subjects that you find there, but somehow reflect curriculum that you can find also in Mel, and Buddhist Institute for Monks, and also outside Sichuan. But these were very small schools, so not schools that were open for decades. They were open for like 3 years and then close and then reopen again. So it was a kind of very, very fragile situation in that sense. So when it comes to Wenjian, Xian, between 1930 and 1939, you have the opening of a number of schools. Between some of them, well, the first one at the Longhui nunnery, and then it was reopened and moved to Donggongsi. It was moved to this other nunnery, especially because of the Sino-Japanese War, which caused a lot of relocation of monastics. So the first 3 years was from 1930 to 1932. Then there was a partial closure in 1933, 1934. Only lay women were studying at that time. Then it was decided again to reopen in December 1935. Was the Buddhist Association that decided to reopen it, and it was reopened in February 1936. Then the school moved to Tong'on Nunnery from 1937 to 1939. And that's when Tong'on Nunnery, between the own nuns, the resident nuns, plus the student nuns, became a huge nunnery for those years in Wenjiang. Then it was reopened again in 1940, but then closed completely in 1944. In all the Buddhist journals that you read, the Sichuanese Buddhist journal or newspaper, you find many, many articles that talk about these specific schools and the importance to have schools for nuns in Wenjiang. You remember that Wenjiang is the area where you have the majority of the monastics are nuns. Some of them go to the temple when they are very little. So most of them actually needed an elementary education besides just the Buddhist education. All these journals say how important it is to have institute for nuns, how the education of nuns is good for Buddhism in general, and how it's also good, especially during the Sino-Japanese War, because they can, if it's a better Sangha, you can rescue the country, the nation, you can rescue people, you can rescue the world. So there's a number of these slogans over there. Tizan nunnery, the one that doesn't exist anymore, also had a specific school. This school was a little bit more complex than the previous ones in Wenjiang because it had 2 different classes, a more elementary level and the advanced level. And those who graduated from the elementary level started to attend the advanced schools. The curriculum was pretty much the same of what you find also in the schools in Wenjiang. The monk Taishu, that is so important for the history of modern Chinese Buddhism, actually visited this nunnery because of his specific school and started claiming how important it was for nuns. He gave his talk that is actually it was published in his collection of books, and he said how important was for the status of women in Chinese society, and not just for the status of nuns, to have educated nuns, and also how much still had to be done for nuns in those years. Our Jinshan nunnery, the small nunnery that inspired me so much, hosted also a female school. So all the schools that I mentioned from Wenjiang, the one in Tizan nunnery, and this school were schools that were open or somehow directed by Chang Yuan, that particular monk. But he also asked a number of nuns to Neijiang, for instance, to teach in Wenjiang, in the schools in Wenjiang. And even here you have the very, very young Longlian that start teaching in this specific school. So he opened a male Buddhist institute for monks in 1942 called the Lotus School Institute for Monks. And then 2 years later, he opened this one for nuns. And most of the classes were held at Jinsha. Some of them at Aitao Hall, but most of them were held at Jinsha. I see. Try to skip a few slides, maybe. Well, nuns in Neijiang. Neijiang is the one of Xilin-Si, the nunnery, the male nunnery that was bought by the nun Yang Hui and turned into a female nunnery. She didn't just turn into a female nun. She was, and she was not just a leader of a temple, but she even started a number of education activities for the nuns in the late 1930s, so as soon as she created this nunnery. And the school was called Aitao Buddhist Society. As you notice, it's a kind of name that you find very often for Institute for Nuns. She then, but it lasted very little, and she then reopened another one in the 1980s, but also lasted not too long. When it comes to Suining, the same nun Chang Wei, the one that kind of rebuilt the Taiping Si, founded the Buddha Dharma School for Fa Xue Xiao in the Aitao Buddhist Society as soon as she became a nun. And in the end of the Republican period, the final years of the Republican period, the Buddhist Society was still organizing some classes. And then in those years, in 1945, the nuns even called Neijiang, the very famous intellectual, to give some lecture there. So Neijiang actually went to this nunnery, but at that time was quite, had not 90, but at least 50 or 60 nuns living there and giving this particular lecture series to nuns, but also lay people could go and attend. So it was very clear to the nuns of Suining that education for nuns and Buddhist education for the laity were very important. Women author, here I can go very quickly, and I just mentioned Chang Wei that left a collection of poems, but this is something that you find very often in many of the nuns that I mentioned. The Sino-Japanese conflict. So monks were active in many ways during the Sino-Japanese conflict. One of them, one way was to support the army through training and rescue aid. So you have monks, especially monks doing it. Nuns were, you have this photo that I found in a museum in very close to Chengdu, where you have nuns that were sewing uniforms for the military. So that was one way of the nuns to be part, to be supporting of the nation during the conflict, but also we were organizing at the same time, same things that monks were also doing, but were organizing a number of liturgies in protection of the nation, liturgies for peace. So they were pretty much protagonists of that atmosphere. If I can have only 5 minutes, I can talk a little bit of these memorialization strategies. So what happened here is that these nuns didn't leave much written, and it's also very difficult to rebuild their history. So what I did from periodicals, you do find some material, but it's not very much. So when I visited Jinsha Nunnery in 2015, one of the very first things that I asked the abbess was, do you have any history of a temple? Do you have any material? And then she took me to a hall very close next to the Taxiong Paotian, to the main shrine hall, where you have all these portraits of nuns, or even drawing. This was a drawing. And there were also some monks and some relics, and kind of blessed by Amitabha and Guanyin and the Western Pure Land. So she told me that that was the memory of the community. So these icons, then I asked the names, who were these monks and nuns, and I found out that most of them were nuns from Jinsha Nunnery, but others were also nuns coming from other nunneries. There were also monks like Nanhai that they found was important for their own community. So somehow over here, there was the identity of a so-called Jinsha community that goes beyond the border of Jinsha nunnery. So it's a kind of, it's a way to show how the identity of the community is kind of merging with a larger monastic networks, and they have interacted and developed within the context of a local regional community. So we are facing, for me, an alternative way to reconstruct a kind of loose lineage through pictures. It's a kind of picture history. So Neijiang is one of the nuns that you see there. Then I have an article where I went details of all the big achievements of most of the nuns that you see here. But what is important is there are not just nuns from this nunnery, but it's a way to build a community. It's a way to show that the community can be formed also by other monks or nuns that somehow were important for the foundation, for the history of this particular nunnery. This is not the only example of picture history that I found. When I went to Zhongxin Si, so Zhongxin Nunnery, the one that was rebuilt in the 80s by Long Shou, which you can see here is the same photo that I posted before. I also found the commemorative room. They call it Zutang, so the kind of patriarch hall. And it was a similar name that was also used by the abbess of Jinsha nunnery. And here you have photos and drawings of nuns who either lived at Zhongxin or in other temples in the neighborhood. And of course, the Nun Long Shou is enshrined in the central position of the commemorative room. So Zhongxin Si is one of the only 4 temples that have already reopened in P2 district. There are 4 nuns from other neighboring sites that are now either still closed or destroyed, and so they live in other places, but they died, and they are commemorated and memorialized here. So after the Cultural Revolution, you have a number of nuns that were either obliged to disrobe, or somehow then they start wearing the robe again, but were living in other centers. And somehow after they died, because most of their life they have been nuns, they wanted to be somehow remembered in a Buddhist nunnery and in a Buddhist temple. And the only sacred site that was open in 1886 was Zhongxin Si. So somehow is here you find a number of nuns, and all of them nuns. They were really part of the community of Pixian, of this particular district. So on the one hand, you have the networks and relations that identified the local community in the past, and this history, somehow this identity persists through a picture history. But on the other hand, you also have this red paper, and over there was a Chan lineage. So at the very beginning, the time period when this temple was built, it was a Chan monastery and male monastery. And so all the major monks that somehow were active there, all the most important monks for the Chan Linji school are actually mentioning here. So it seems kind of an overlapping kind of layers of plural identity markers and histories in dialogue over here. Very similar thing in Neijiang, Xilin Si. And in here, at the very center, if you can see my mouse, there is Yang Hui, the nun that turned this male monastery into a female nunnery. So Xilin became a nunnery only in 1938, and since then it has been a reference point for the local Buddhist community in a similar ways to Zhongxin and Jinsha. The frame photos in here were partly of influential abbesses or otherwise resident nuns, and partly of nuns that just visited to have been temporary residents in the nunnery. The frame photo of invisible nun Yang Hui, already mentioned earlier on, who played a central role in turning a male monastery into a place for practice for nuns in 1938, has a central space within the lines of portraits that cover 3 walls of this big hall. And I asked the abbess if she remembers the names of all of them. She remembers only a few names, but not all of them, because some of them were present in Xilin Si before her arrival. So as I said, it's very, very difficult also to reconstruct this kind of picture history. So just a short conclusion. What I wanted to give you today is just a short survey of nunneries and nuns and achievements by nuns, but also an evidence that small peripheric centers had a lively, intense religious lives. Nuns were firm protagonists of this reality, were creators, were leaders of believers, were leaders of surrounding communities, were reference point of surrounding community. So this is another form of eminence that, in my view, in light of the accomplishment that I've listed only in part today, deserve to be told. This is, as I said, a partial picture that I'm looking forward to integrate with new fundings as soon as COVID allows me to go back to China. And I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Travagnin. I think we got everyone's clapping. I'm sure we can't hear them, but they are clapping. We don't have a lot of time, but I think if Stefania, if you're willing to stick around for just a few minutes, maybe we can take 2 or 3 questions. I'll get this rolling, and then I have several, but I'll ask one, and anyone else in the audience, please send your question to the Q&A. My question is sort of relating, I know you started talking about how Sichuan is sort of the marginal area within our main understanding of China, and I felt that was very true as you were presenting. One of the things I think about a lot of what I read in 1920s and 30s Republican religious history tends to emphasize states' efforts to secularize society, and sort of say that, to show that the Nationalist Party, for example, is not so different from the Communist Party in a certain efforts to turn temples into schools or something like this, that we see this, and which I think obviously we do see this, but just looking at your numbers, I was kind of struck by, it appeared to me that Sichuan Buddhism was really flourishing, which is in the Republican period, which is a little counter to what I guess I think I'm reading about, maybe Neijiang region or somewhere else. And
yeah, well, Sichuan was very rich in terms of numbers, and I think a difference with Nanjing was the war, the second conflict with Japan. So in the 1920s, you see the beginning of movement of a military academy, and then some offices from Nanjing to Chongqing, and then in the 30s, you have also Buddhist intellectuals and monastics that move to Sichuan and Chongqing. And for instance, it's called the Metaphysical Institute, the one of Ouyang Jingwu, they had a branch chapter in Chongqing, for instance, and then a number of other things. So there was a kind of chance to move towards the Southwest to be safe from Japan. But indeed, I was also very much, that's why I checked material quite often, and I saw these very big numbers, and in some areas are very big numbers also of nuns for a number of reasons. But
thank you. That's a good obvious answer, which I didn't even think of. The movements too.
Well, you have the military academy started now my mind 1920 something to Chengdu, and then the government office followed much later. But there is, when it comes to Buddhism, there is a very big exchange between Nanjing and Sichuan that developed since the very early Republican period, with monks from Sichuan going there to Nanjing. And then later on, during the Sino-Japanese War, you had the opposite for the war. So there is a very big connection that I know there are the Buddhist Society, Buddhist Association in Sichuan and in Jiangsu, they are now studying this particular exchange.
Thank you. Here we do have actually we have 3 questions. I'm just gonna, since our time is short, I'm just gonna say we'll go with the 3 questions we have right now. And sorry for anyone else who's out there, you'll have to just Google our speaker and find her stuff. So here's a question. Dear Professor, I saw quite a few pictures of old Buddhist lay women on your slides. Can you explain a little the relationship between lay women and nuns?
Oh, wow. A few pictures. Okay, so a few pictures in the sense that there are more nuns. Well, it's difficult to find an account unless you're talking about Buddhist intellectuals. So you have a number of women in the Republican period, not many, but you have some that are Buddhist intellectuals, and they're very active in society and in the Buddhist sphere. And then you have writings by them and also portraits. Otherwise, it's very difficult to find for the normal lay community, the average lay community, it's very difficult to find information of names and identity, like face. So this is why you find more images of nuns than lay women. There were many of them. And I noticed that in my PowerPoint, I just gave a number of monastics, but when it comes to laity in Pixien and Wenjianxian, also in Suining, you have thousands of lay believers, the ones that take refuge in Buddha Dharma Sangha, and some of them define themselves as Zhu Shi. So there was a huge cohort of laity around the monastics, and they were sponsoring monastics. So it was very important. The laity was very important for financial support, also for political reason and negotiation. So, and in Suining, the Idaho Buddhist Society was built on this Nianfo Hall, and the Nianfo Hall was built by free men as a way to have their daughters and other women reunited and gathered there and practice. And they also were organizing some fundraising and social welfare activities to give food to the poor, for instance, and so on. And then later on, this kind of laymen, but they were men, sorry, were not women, but laymen disappear, and the nuns start managing the temple. So in short, there are plenty of lay women or laymen in general, and they were sponsored. The rich ones were good sponsors. They were active presence for rituals. They were requesting rituals. That's something that you also find. And in the pictures that also the very last photo of my PowerPoint was a woman bowing and from Jinsha, and Jinsha was full of lay women going there to do their own rituals. And right now, helping nuns to cook, to find vegetables. So all this kind of manual labor. So there is a big exchange. Monastics need laity, and laity needs monastics.
It sounds like a whole nother project, the lay people. Question.
Yeah.
Here's a question from an anthropology student who's currently living in Neijiang. And she says she's fascinated by the nun community at Suining Nunnery. And her question is, do the nuns build and pass on their history by storytelling? What about the oral history of nunneries? Can you say something about oral history?
Yes, not so much about that particular nunnery. So when I went there, I visited the nunnery. I met, well, yes, a little bit also here. So I met the abbess, and she gave me some written paper of the history of the temple for me to use. And then she started telling me what she remembers, what she heard about Yang Hui, the nun that bought a male temple and turned it into a female nunnery. And so there was a kind of oral history over there, but I found more of them in Chengdu, mostly because I work more on Jinsha nunnery. I mean, I started working on them in 2015, and I have nuns from another nunnery, Aitao Tang, that they are very close to Jinsha nunnery, physically are very close, but also they have quite strong connection. And then these nuns really helped me to recover material, and they interview old nuns that start telling them their own memories of what they heard from even the previous nuns about Chang Yuan, about that particular monk. And of course, very, very old nuns speak in very, very strict Chengdu dialect. So I'm very, very grateful. My Mandarin is fine. My Sichuanese dialect is getting better. But when it comes to strict, then it's a problem. So these nuns from Aitao Tang were amazing. So they wrote down the interviews that they made, and they helped me to meet these other nuns. And so I got all these stories. But of course, when you have this oral history, which is extremely important, as these students said, is extremely important, because otherwise you hardly have information about these very small sites. They are hardly mentioned in the Buddhist journals, on the Buddhist newspaper, especially when it comes to nuns. And so when I said that I like to work on small sites, I believe that I work on small sites, but my small sites are still somehow, those sites still have some written memory in the Buddhist journals. So there are a number of other small sites that are that I know existed, but are very, very difficult to recover history from them. So then again, it's very important to have this oral history, but also to kind of double check with some archived material and to see how much is a local legend and how much is real history. And when it's just a local legend, it's also important because it gives you an idea of the extent to which a nunnery or a nun were relevant for the community. So yes, indeed.
Thank you. And there another question did appear, but it's rather long and involved. I'm going to encourage that person maybe to look up Dr. Travagnin yourself and make and engage on one-to-one on that rather detailed question, because our time is quite limited and we're actually way over. I will ask the one other short question that's on a different plane. It's a question is, what if
but it's a very important.
Oh, is it? You have time.
Well, what's more from my perspective with feminism? People show strong interest in bettering female position. Yeah, but it's convoluted, as you said.
I think it may be, for our purposes, maybe.
Well, I really invite this person to email me. But something that she said about rules is there is the Pajimfa, the Ashta Guru Dhamma, with specific rules for nuns that are very important in mainland China. They're less important in, how can I say, there were feminist nuns in Taiwan. They've been fighting against the Pajimfa, and these feminist, Western style feminist nuns are not much appreciated in mainland China. They really believe more in tradition. So Buddhism in mainland China, and especially in Sichuan, is very conservative and traditional when it comes to Vinaya. That's something that you find also in the Republican period, where there was a big revival of attention to the Vinaya. If you follow the Vinaya, the discipline, then automatically you have a revival of Buddhism. So that was the...
Okay. You two should talk more. Now I'm going to just, the one last question I'll give you, which is kind of an interesting one here. Where would you suggest someone go if they want to experience being a nun?
A day of being a nun.
Does such a place exist?
No, you cannot be a nun for a day. What you can do is, well, in mainland China, it's kind of difficult to live inside nunneries and stay overnight in a nunnery. It's more easy. It's something that can be done in Taiwan, maybe a little bit tricky to be done in mainland China. And which place to go? Each place is nice. I mean, I can also mention Jimingzi in Nanjing is a fantastic nunnery with a very long history of very strong nuns in the Republican period and after 1980s. But I think it would be nice for if someone has a very interest in understanding a little bit more what is the daily life of a nun. You can be a nun for a day, sorry, but you can spend time with them and just go there in the morning and spend time with them and see all the liturgy schedule, how they making food and eating, and how they deal with the people around them. Even spending a few hours can give you an idea of what is their lifestyle and how they see, how they perceive their own mission in society. And I think every nunnery could be a good starting point. But, you know, if that particular person wants to be in touch with me and has any trip in mind to China or Taiwan, I would be happy to give advice.
When we can finally do trips again. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I thank you. Again, our Zoom clapping. Thank you, Professor Travagnin, for this great talk and the hard work you're doing to bring to the front.
Well, about the question about feminists, it's something that I was reading the other day, but this is going to be one of the next articles because it's going in the 50s, in the Mao era. So it's not so much Republican Sichuan. But I found very interesting articles about Buddhist nuns marching for the Women's Day. and yeah, and it was quite, and also these nuns say, oh, the lay women were looking at us, were surprised to see us here, but you know, we are all for. So it was very, very interesting to read about These nuns, and also in quite good nunneries, and very well-known nunneries in Chengdu, doing this in the 50s. So there is so much to know about nuns, but also about monks. So something that I want to make sure today talk about nuns because you asked me to. But there are a number of small sites, male small sites, and like Changyuan and Qingfu, these two monks that I showed at the beginning of my slides, and then somehow come back in my talk later on, that have been instrumental for nuns, inspired by nuns. And they are amazing in terms of what they actually did for the revival of Buddhism in the Republican period in different places of Sichuan. And they're hardly known, they're hardly mentioned in Chinese scholarship or even Western scholarship. So this kind of invisibility that I mentioned before is really cross-gender. So it's not just a nun's issue once in a while.
Seems like what is the key of your project here is making that invisible visible again. So everyone interested in religion in China is looking forward to more of your talks and publications, I'm sure. Well,
thank you.
Thank you everyone for turning out today and sticking with us. And it was this is our last China on the Palouse of the academic year. We will just keep tuned. Look at our Facebook page, East Asian Studies, University of Idaho, to see what we've got planned for the fall. We don't quite know what we've got planned yet, but we'll have something up there eventually. And keep studying, everyone. So long. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.